Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to continue from our discussion on the last discussion on timber constructions, and in the last class we have discussed about the various types of timber construction techniques, especially timber as a vernacular building material in the context of European context and especially in the British context, where we have discussed about the crack truss and different ways of cladding types, including the wattle and daub techniques, including the mathematical types, and also the renders, different renders we talked about. So that is just a kind of understanding from the one perspective, and today what I am going to discuss is about my journey and how, when I was working in England, and how it started with the advanced timber frame technologies, and from there how my whole journey has molded, and today how from advanced to vernacular, and what right now I am working on. And so I'll give you a brief discussion on introduction to the advanced timber frame technologies, what I have executed in UK and in other places, and how some of the questions in my mind which came at that point of time, how it led to the long time research, and that is where it has shown a direction into the study of vernacular issues. So and later in this lecture we'll be covering on our current project, especially with the help of my PhD student Naina Singh. We are working on the Uttarakhand disaster recovery areas. So that will be a brief insight on timber frame constructions and timber constructions as well. So somewhere in 2005, I was working as a designer in Benfield Advanced Timber Frame Technologies, and this is where my very first interaction with the timber frame, because before that I was working in India and I was introduced to the timber frame technologies. It was so fascinating to learn a new technology, and it's a very fast track position, because it was a whole factory is there, and the whole supply process as well as the manufacturing and the erection systems. So a building starting from A to Z is completely taken up, and that is where it's a very holistic understanding of the timber constructions, and that is where I have introduced with the TRADA and different regulatory systems and different manufacturing processes. And not only that, there are also issues in how we can reduce the waste, and how it can show a direction to the sustainability issues. So while I was working in this place, in fact, did a couple of projects on the timber frame designs as well as the manufacturing. And there's one project where it's a small project. It was about doing a kind of prototype houses for the United Nations World Tourism Organizations after the Kashmir earthquake. And when the client was someone from the United Nations, and when they were trying to offer for a kind of prototype houses which could be repeated. So I was designing that, and then they were all manufactured, they were sent back. That was the time I got a question in my mind. I have not visited the site, I have not familiar with what is the site plan, and what is the site context, and how I am able to design the very uniform set of housing solution to a different cultural context. So that is where I started investigating and writing a proposal, and that is how I got into the PhD, and further my journey has carried on. But nevertheless, it's a good start to just to think what I am doing. So just to introduce you, first of all, much of the literature talks about the timber. Of course, there are two versions which you talk in the Asian context, especially with the kind of limited timber resources. Obviously, it has been looking at the kind of why we have to cut down the trees. But whereas in the Western context, timber is one of the abundantly available resource, and that is where it is it's a naturally renewable resource, and over 97% of the soft timber used in the UK comes from Europe, where the forest area is increasing by the equivalent of 90 football pitches every hour of day and night. So that is where what you can see here is FSC, it's a Forest Stewardship Council, and what this symbolizes is how it is properly, whether the timber is coming from a well managed forest or not. It talks about the logistics and the supply chain phenomenon, and it also talks about both the afforestation and deforestation aspects of it, and how we can have a control on the environment. So what does this FSC does? The FSC it's a label, Forest Stewardship Council label, which guarantees that the trees that are harvested are replaced or allowed to regenerate naturally. So apart from the trees, there are also other concerns, because the moment you are cutting down some trees, obviously it is going to have an impact on the wildlife. Sometimes it is going to create an impact on some very rare species. In fact, I was recently in Pulicat Lake somewhere in Tamil Nadu, and the birds travel from Canada or migrate for a particular few months, just to eat a small snake or a leech which is in that water species. The moment if these water systems or these ecosystem degenerates or degrades gradually, then what happens is the migratory patterns disturbs, then obviously there will be a bigger impact in the larger ecosystems and to the human environments. So now, because of various deforestation methods, many of the wild species, they are now coming to the city because their home has been captured. So one has to make sure that you don't disturb the wildlife species and their home and their habitat. And it also talks about, FSC talks about the rights of indigenous people use of the forest, because it is they are privileged to live in this forest, and there are also certain sacred sites and which you have to protect, because it could be a waterfall, it could be a memory to a particular community, it could be a certain sacred environment. So this FSC also provides an assurance that future generations will be able to enjoy the benefits of the forest. And wherever the indigenous tribes living in these forests, obviously we should not create any impact on their lives and livelihoods. So the moment a new company is coming, and so obviously how you can't just send them away by giving some money or anything like that. So basically how you can actually engage them, how you can actually doesn't create any impact on their habitat. So this is one thing we have to look at. And the forest owners must also use local workers to run the forest and provide training, safety equipment, and a decent salary. So, and again, you can see which are the FSC products. So obviously the label talks about which are the FSC and which are the non-forest timber, which, like for example, you get all the latex gloves, and they're all non-forest timber products. Then the first thing we have to do is the choose and use of right timber. The timber use of structural applications, first of all, it must be graded and clearly marked to show it complies with the correct standards, because in UK we have the British standards. So each timber which you are applying for a particular spans, is it a particular grade, the thorough grade of it, and a particular length, and what kind of standard it is reflecting, and that is where we have to reflect with the span tables. So that is the apt requirement of the building codes and regulations. And the load of a member can carry depends on several factors, that is the span of the flow, thickness, width, and the type of species. If it is a oak or if it is any other species like any other local trees, so the strength varies. Usually the deeper or the wider the section, the longer the span. So different species have different strength properties. So one have to be very careful in choosing the timber. For example, you can see here the first how timber is graded. So now you can see a C16 here, which is C16 grade, and this is called visual strength grading. So normally the trademark a certification body, and it's a British standard, which is a standard reference, which is a dry graded, and then the company logo, and it has a strength and class and a species of it. So it basically talks about that define the strength, define the size, the type, and the number of strength reducing characteristics allowed in each grade. For example, natural features such as knots, vein. Vein is nothing but an uneven edge caused by the reside of a bark. Whereas the slope of a grain, how the slope of the grain you have, plus splits, if there is any cracks or splits. Shakes. Shakes is nothing but a kind of fissure caused by the splitting of wood fibers along the grain. So the other one is by looking at a piece you are grading. The second one is a machine strength grading. So here you can see the M, that is what reflects the machine grade. And then for example, I'll just show you a brief classification. One is you have the British pine, the spruce, Douglas fir, and larch, and you have the grading rules here, and you have the general structural C14, C16, C18, C22, C24, TR26. So like that you have certain strength classes, and there are also special structural. So that is how it is classified. And then what we do is like you have the following species like the sizes 38 by 97, 47 by 97, 47 by 220. So for instance, you can see if you are using 38 by 97, so in fact in C16 clear maximum span you can go for 1.76, whereas in C24 you can go for 2.5. So which means by changing the grade you can go for the bigger lens. So if you wanted to span 4 meters at 600 mm centers, so which is like, let's say this is a 600 centers, a flow joist, and you could use 38 by 220 C24 instead of 47 by 220. So which means the depth of the timber is changing, and if you are changing the grade of the timber. This is how a typical wall section is in the most of the UK in the recent times, and this is what you see the timber studs, and this is the windowsill, and you have a 50 mm cavity. The panels, the timber panels are normally external. Usually we used to follow about 38 by 140, that's the common width, and whereas if it is the internal panels 38 by 89, but in 140 you have this, which is a kind of 9 mm OSB, Oriented strand board, and over that you have Tyvek membrane, which is a breathable membrane, and then you have about 50 mm cavity, and then the brick wall continues. So and you have the DPC here. So this is how, and in between these panels you have the insulation material as well, thermal insulation. So what one does is this will protect from the weather conditions, and this is the general makeup of the wall. And I just show you a small project how it's done somewhere in Oxford. And generally when the architects gives you the plan, so you actually study the plan and the sections and the elevations. And the first thing what we do is normally, so you have draw all the sections and elevations. Then what we do is we actually break, let's say if this is a wall, this is a wall and this is a window. So what we do is we take from one edge and then we mark into EP1, EP2, EP3. So that works actually, because we need to give a little buffer place for placing the lintel load, 2 studs or 3 studs. So at the same time in the corner stud how it works is, so you have one panel sits here and another panel sits here and the another Turner stud, so that we can nail it here. So this is how the panels are done in a kind of cyclic process, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the same time, the internals are normally represented by IP 01, 02 like that. So similarly, the first floor we do. And then when we draw the sections, the structural engineer also already have mentioned where to keep the beams, right? So when we know these are the places we need to give the beams or the steel members, steel sections, so one has to really carefully draft with the spacing aspect of the joist, as well as if there is any other structural considerations we have to give support for those structural elements. Like for example, here he mentioned about 140 by 270 glue lamps. So obviously we need to the other side of it, how we can create a beam and then provide. And this particular roof is all basically a kind of cut roof. So this is how a joist layout looks like. You can see the blue lines here. These are the steel sections where the staircase is coming and wherever the complicated areas. So that is where the structural engineer has mentioned, yeah, keep these places here. So the moment you are keeping this, then obviously at these places you have to give a structural provision with having some more studs under it. So this is how another project in Rutland, restoration project, and you have the beam and block foundations over this. Then the first thing what we do is, after doing every layout of the manufacturing process, then that goes to the erection team. That is where we get the sole plate layout. So diagonally what we do measure, and we make sure that a sole plate layout is made. And then the panels are erected, and this is how you can see this is a stone because it's a restoration project. So there's a context of the stone facade is needed. So what we did was, instead of brick we kept for a stone, and you can see the attic truss, the whole truss is manufactured and sent to the site, and they are erected. And this is how a panels looks like. And the 9 mm OSB oriented strand board, and you have the nail plates, and this is the panel, this is the head binder, and then again on the top of the panel. So this is how a window is made, and this is have the lintels which is resting here, and there's any packer material we fill it, and whenever there is a load coming up, the engineer suggests to have these as per the span tables. And then they also how they erect, and the roof, they follow the safety aspects as well. So how you can actually go step by step and put some kind of temporary supports. And this is called bird's mouth, and this is how a wooden deck, 22 mm wooden deck is placed. So this is how a brief introduction of how the timber frame construction is made. It's a prefab kind of thing, everything manufactured in the factory and sent to the site. They are erected in 1, 2 weeks, 3 weeks time, and that's it, the end of the project. And then the brickwork comes on. So it's a very quick process. But only thing is, we have to take care of each and every minute details into considerations. Even a 2 mm mistake happens a bigger cost and time in the site. So now the challenge is, can design becomes a challenge for ensuring sustainability? Can we reduce waste by design? As I said, the moment we do any mistake in our drawing, it becomes more waste in the site, it becomes more cost, and it becomes more travel time. So obviously this is one important aspect. So can we plan with time and money? And can we deliver aptly on time, especially in the cold countries because of the weather conditions? How we can actually, how this particular system have to worked out in such a way the whole project management is carried out so that we can deliver it on time. So this was my learning, and as I said, by doing these projects I just realized that how why not these kind of advanced technologies are not taken to the Indian context and the Uttarakhand. So that is where I still haven't found an answer so far, but still I would give you my journey on how right now we are working in Uttarakhand, especially on the hilly areas of Uttarakhand, and along with one of my PhD students is also working on disaster affected areas, especially she is looking at the indigenous knowledge. So from advanced, I am taking you to the indigenous systems, how the traditional timber buildings have sustained, and what is the present state of it, and how people are responding to it. So this is in the Himalayan region. the greater and lesser Himalayan region. And this is the site which I am showing you from a couple of sites which we traveled around, and there's ranges from Gangotri Glacier to the Yamunotri Glacier. So this one is near Harsil, which is before Gangotri. You have a small hutment site of him, is a cantonment area as well as a small village. And this is called Baghuri, which is a kind of Butillon village, and it's a tribal village sort of thing. And what you can see is a kind of traditional timber construction. It's a kind of Katkuni type of constructions where you have the horizontal members of timber, and then intermediate construction. Intermediate is full of the stone component. So that, because being an earthquake prone area, this is one of the important traditional constructions which this region has adopted. And most of the cases, what they do is in the bottom, they have staples or for as a granary, or maybe for the animals to be there. And you can see some of the dwellings. You have a small little piles, and then they are all on the timber frames. And being a Buddhist society, they also have the traditional temple looked constructed with the bright colors because of these particular dark. So much of the winter time, that is one thing. Having a bright colors also give a visual access. Wherever you are going around near the mountains, you can see that yellowish color or these red and blue. You can see that settlement existed here. So that is one of the reason, symbolically the colors also talk about the context. So this is how the Buddhist environment. And you can see here the bottom, the ground floor is either it's a shop converted into shops, or sometimes it is meant for cattle. On the first floor, people normally stay. So everything is made of timber. It was all because earlier they used to get the access to the deodar wood. So because in the higher altitudes, accessibility to the deodar is also one of the prominent aspect. And in those days, the skilled labor also talked about, they looked at the kind of decorative aspect of it, they looked at the construction technology. And because in wooden houses, what happens in these cold climates, it makes you warm in the winter and it makes you cool in the summer. So you can see the kind of intricate work which the artisans have made of that times. And unfortunately, what we see here is many of these houses are still vacant because some of them have migrated and some of them are on a seasonal basis. So you can see the kind of the whole intricate work. Now, what is happening to these kind of settlement? Because this is a kind of transit. It has become a kind of transit settlement because 6 months they live downhills, and 6 to 4 months they may not live here because of the harsh winters, and because of lack of proper maintenance or any other thing. So many of the villages around this region, they don't live here, so they go to either Uttarkashi area or Duda and they sell there. So in the summer time they put the cattle and sheep. Only 1 or 2 people live there just to take care of the village. Otherwise most of the people migrate to the downside. Now, one of the classic examples what you can see here is because now earlier the timber was accessible and it was available and it was accessible to the local communities. But now because of some certain forest regulatory acts, one family can get only 1 tree. So because of that limitation, so they had a difficulty in constructing the same way which they had. So gradually what they have adopted is a kind of concrete blocks or the brick and concrete work or the AUC blocks. So in that way what you can see is a part of the timber and as well as part of the the usual materials which we use in urban context. So you can see the brick and concrete buildings and adjacent. So how is one house has been modified. On one side you have the traditional and you have the modern. But what one you can notice is, if you look at the way they are looking at the sill heights, the window heights, the roof heights, they have a sensitivity of how to match even the size and the plan of the rooms according to their context. So Similarly here the blocks which they have used and the front facade, because most of the time this particular place is used mostly for their livelihood activities, because they yarn and they do any kind of domestic works. The women will be weaving sweaters, so there are a lot of work which is happening in this area. So even still you can see, and some of these timber houses, they resisted many earthquakes. So this is again, this is one of the typical form of a kind of granaries in Uttarakhand. In the hill regions, these are some of the Uttarakhand granaries. So what they do is, because they have to store the grains for the rest of the year, for 6 to 4 months. So what they do is, once you go in, it's a very small openings. Once they go inside, they have under a little down into it, they have a room sort of thing, and then they store all the grains. So you can see how the modern developments are happening, and in the similar way. Now this is one classic example. Here, this particular houses, you can find many of these houses here and there, because they are gradually getting abandoned, because some of the families have migrated down. And who owns it and what to do with it, no one knows. So everywhere in Uttarakhand when you travel, you can see all these traditional houses which are done with a rich timber buildings are unmaintained, and no one is having an idea how we can retrofit this, how we can requalify these for new uses. So similarly you can see the kind of work, the craftsmanship, how they have detailed it out, and very with a simple understanding what they need. And that is near Harsil, and further down you can also find in places of Koti Banal of even a 7 to 8 storied buildings, of a multi-storied buildings built with stone and timber, which is using the Katkuni styles. And so you can see the alternate bands of timber, stone, and sometimes you can even find 7 to 8 stories of building, a group of houses of a Koti. This is what they refer as kind of Koti Banal style. So you will find a village of, because that hilly area, you will find that series of houses in that same fashion. You can see here. And in fact, you will be surprised to see how many rooms inside are there. I have seen, at least I have visited about 28 rooms in one building, small rooms, and they have multiple aspects. Sometimes it is one big family who will be living and how they're functioning. It itself is a very interesting to understand how they use these spaces, in what period of the year, and what gender use the space. Like one good example, this is about this one long house. You see about more than 28 rooms within it. So here, this is a side section of it. It's not like there's a vertical transition, and then in the bottom part they have for animals. So what you can, they have the cattle, they have the grass, so that makes them also warm, having the animals in the ground floor areas. And similarly, the religious aspects of it, any temples, you find a typical temples of this Barkot region. This is near, it's near Barkot. It's called Ponti village. So here the Bhadrakali temple is, you can see the kind of technology they've used and the joints. This is the timber and the stone bands, and how it is overlaid one another, and the whole temple structure. And this is the very common style which you will find in this region, and which might have survived many earthquakes, and till now these are the symbolic aspects of that particular communities. And again, the granaries which I told you, so some of the granaries. So but inside the homes also they have some of the granaries. Like for example, if you look at the scale, it is almost about 2.5 to 3 feet height. So you can see a person is bending and going, and once you go inside, you'll see the granary, the storage areas, completely coupled up with the wooden battens, and it keeps the the necessary items in without spoiling them during winter or in the summer. Now, after the earthquake and the floods, there are a lot of recent modifications which are happening in this region. Especially the new buildings are coming and the old buildings are abandoned. So at the same time, on one side they are abandoning these old buildings, but during the winter I have seen people using the same buildings because it makes them warm. Like a good example of this. So in earthquake, this particular facade has fallen like this, and then they've built another one. But in this case, what they're doing is, you can see they are cooking, they are using this space even now, right? So in winter they are even sleeping there. So despite of having a modern interventions in their places, but still these old buildings, so becomes a kind of double house concept. And similarly here, so still this particular, sometimes the old people, they are still using these places, and the younger generation started using here because of certain modernity and modern impressions which they are thinking of. But ideally for a climatic reason, this is much more sensitive to the climate. But now much more in advance. So we have seen an adaptation. One is an abandoned version of it, and one is a seasonal version of it, and the third one is side by side you have a double house concept. You are using this and that, but you see completely which is irrelevant of what they have lived. So these are somewhere near Karadi village in Yamunotri, and you can see after the disaster they migrated somewhere and they built completely new, which has nothing to do with because the style, the living style also have gradually changing, and they believe that this is a kind of durable nature. And the problem of all these, why we are trying to ignore these traditional technologies. One, legally, first of all, there is a legal restriction, because the moment the forest regulation acts have a control with your access, obviously that is one limitation. The second limitation is availability of craftsmen. Who will does all the craftsmen? It is more expensive to build a timber home now rather than building a brick and concrete home. Is much more easier and much more least expensive. So people are going for that. So, and the other thing is how are the building codes or any other codes, the structural codes, how are they categorizing these indigenous techniques? So that is where I think the Central Building Research Institute in India, they are also doing on validation of these traditional technologies, especially with the Ministry of Rural Development. So in the same process, I can show you some good examples of especially the Daji constructions, and where the Pakistan government is working on a guidebook for technicians and artisans, how to do a Daji construction, what are the technicalities involved in it, how we can qualify these traditional technologies into the code process, and how we can make them eligible. So then that is one way only we can bring these traditions back into the modern times in the present context. Thank you very much.